This is Beyond the Business.
In navigation, there is a moment called the non-return point. It is not dramatic and it is not a failure. It is simply the point where returning is no longer the safest option. From that moment on, the task is no longer to decide whether to continue or turn back. The task becomes to maneuver correctly because the system has already moved into a different regime. That concept matters today not as a metaphor, but as a description of where we are now. Not because something suddenly collapsed, but because the accumulation of decisions, infrastructure, emissions, and pressure has crossed a threshold where old assumptions no longer apply. We are no longer operating in a world where actions come first and consequences follow later. We are operating inside consequences that are already unfolding. And this is the critical shift. When you are still before the non-return point, delay can be called prudence. Hesitation can be framed as responsibility. Options still feel open. Beyond that point, delay becomes a decision in itself, and this is where governance quietly starts to fail. Because institutions continue to behave as if reality is still waiting for decisions, while reality has already moved on. This episode is not about panic and not about blame. It is about recognizing that we have entered a phase where the existing architecture of decision making is no longer sufficient. And once you recognize that, one question becomes unavoidable. If damage is already accumulating, who is actually responsible to prevent it? This is the ocean of waste. There are moments when systems change their behavior not because a decision was made, but because accumulated pressure reaches a point where response becomes inevitable. Nothing dramatic marks that transition. There is no single event that clearly signals it. The shift happens quietly through temperature, chemistry, infrastructure, and time. And the one day it becomes visible. Oceans reorganize, ecosystems shift, coastlines erode, insurance markets tightened. And the food systems will become volatile and supply chains will behave differently. Not because we decided that they should, because the system has crossed the thresholds. This is the uncomfortable reality. In complex systems, control is not a permanent state. Control is a condition that must be continuously verified. Yet most decision-making structures still behave as if control is guaranteed. They treat the future as a design space, a space of choices. But increasingly, we are dealing with an outcome space, consequences already in motion interacting with everything else. And this is where governance becomes dangerous, when it keeps applying tools designed for a phase that no longer exists. For a long time, governance rested on a simple sequence. We acted first and systems responded later. We extracted resources and impacts followed at a manageable distance. We expanded infrastructure and adjusted once consequences appeared. We made mistakes and corrected them with the time on our side. That logic shaped regulations, planning, and public communication. But it no longer holds. Many of the effects we are observing today are not reactions to recent actions. They are delayed outcomes of decades of accumulated pressure, finally reaching visible thresholds. Which means the most important variable is not drama, it is a time lag. A system can be pushed quietly for a long time and appear stable, and then the response arrives abruptly, not as a warning, but as a phase shift. This is why the language of "we still have time" is so seductive and so dangerous. Time is not one thing. Some processes still have time, others don't. And when everything is compressed into a single timeline, we create the illusion that decisions are still ahead of consequences, even when consequences are already unfolding. This is a widespread belief that carefully managed messaging preserves stability, that avoiding strong signals prevents panic, that gradual language buys time. In practice, it often does the opposite. When information about systemic risk remains confined to technical reports and expert discussions, society loses the opportunity to adapt early. The system continues to change, but public awareness lags behind. By the time impacts become undeniable, they arrive as shocks rather than transitions. This is when trust erodes, and not because reality is difficult, but because it arrives without preparation. Delayed communication does not reduce disruption, it concentrates it. And there is another mechanism hiding inside this. If you avoid naming the situation clearly, people assume there is nothing to name. They assume it is manageable. They assume institutions are in control. So the system becomes fragile in a very specific way. Fragile not because it lacks intelligence, but because it lacks shared understanding. And without shared understanding, responsibility cannot scale. We don't have a data problem. We model climate behavior. We track ocean temperatures. We measure emissions, biodiversity loss, and infrastructure exposure. What is missing is ownership. Responsibility is fragmented across institutions, jurisdictions, and timelines. Decisions are distributed in a way that makes accountability diffuse and consequences abstract. Risks are acknowledged internally but rarely translated into shared understanding. Plans exist, but their limits are not openly discussed. Progress is reported while systemic exposure quietly increases. Everyone can say they are doing something. No one can say they are responsible for outcomes. Because outcomes sit across departments, across election cycles, across supply chains, and across the invisible boundary where economic activity becomes physical reality. This is how a society can be fully informed and still unprepared. Education stuck in the wrong era. Environmental education has not evolved at the same pace as the problem itself. For decades, it focused on individual behavior, recycling, conserving water, reducing waste. These messages made sense when impacts were smaller and feedback was faster. Today's challenges are structural. They involve cumulative pressure, delayed response, global infrastructure, and long-term system memory. None of this is intuitive without explanation. Yes, these concepts are rarely taught as a foundational knowledge, not in schools, not in public discourse, not in political debate. Without systemic literacy, responsibility cannot scale. People are asked to care, but not equipped to understand what caring actually requires. And that gap itself becomes a governance risk. Modern environmental narratives often revolve around rescue. Saving species, cleaning spills, restoring damaged ecosystems. These efforts matter, but they operate downstream. They address outcomes and not the causes. When prevention is absent, rescue becomes an endless loop. Resources are spent mitigating damage that continues to be generated elsewhere in the system. This creates the illusion of action while leaving the underlying architecture untouched. Prevention requires uncomfortable decisions. Rescue doesn't. Rescue produces images and moral clarity. Prevention produces conflict, trade-offs, and delayed political reward. And so the system gravitates toward what is emotionally visible rather than structurally effective. At this point, it is tempting to say, so we need better environmental policy. But that sentence hides a deeper problem, because environmental damage does not exist in isolation. It emerges from systems that are governed elsewhere. So let's slow down and look at how modern states are actually organized. Not in theory, in practice. Most governments are built around sectoral ministries. There is a Ministry of Agriculture, a Ministry of Economy or Industry, Ministry of Labor, of Transport, Energy, and usually somewhere among them a Ministry of Environment. Each of these institutions exists for a reason. Each of them performs an important function, and each of them is, in its own domain, largely rational. But none of them are designed to prevent systemic damage. Let's take them one by one. The Ministry of Agriculture, for example, is tasked with food security, yields, rural employment, and price stability, and export volumes. Its success is measured in tons. Environmental effects are treated as constraints or externalities, things to be managed so they don't interfere with the output. Runoff into rivers is not the core metric. Eutrophication of deltas is not the performance indicator. Long-term ocean degradation is not part of its optimization function. The Ministry of Economy or Industry is tasked with growth, competitiveness, investment, and jobs. It works on quarterly and annual cycles. Environmental damage appears in its models as a cost, risk, or trade-off, something to be balanced against economic objectives. If pollution can be taxed, priced, or offset, the system still functions. The question is not whether damage accumulates, but whether it disrupts growth fast enough to matter politically. The Ministry of Labor is concerned with employment, wages, and social stability. Its horizon is human, immediate, and domestic. Ecological degradations enters the picture only once it translates into layoffs, migration, or unrest. Oceans are far away, thresholds are abstract, damage unfolds outside the labor market's time frame. The Ministry of Transport focuses on connectivity, efficiency, and infrastructure, shipping lanes, ports, logistics corridors. Environmental effects are treated as operational risks or compliance issues and not as systemic limits. The Ministry of Energy manages supply, security, and transition pathways. Its language is capacity, demand, and resilience. Environmental degradation becomes relevant mainly when it affects energy systems themselves. And then there is the Ministry of Environment. This ministry is often expected to handle nature. In reality, it is usually tasked with compliance, permitting, reporting, protected areas, and enforcement of existing rules. It operates downstream, after economic decisions have already been made, after land has been allocated, after infrastructure has been built. It rarely has authority over agriculture, industry, transport, or trade. It rarely sets the rules of the game. It enforces them once they exist. So here is the structural reality. Every ministry optimizes its own sector. None of them optimizes the prevention of damage across sectors. Environmental damage, especially damage to oceans, does not belong to any single ministry's core mandate. It emerges from agriculture, transport, industry, consumption, and trade combined. It accumulates across rivers, deltas, and supply chains. It unfolds over decades. And because it sits between ministries, it is owned by none of them. This is why we can have sophisticated environmental regulations and still watch ocean systems degrade. Not because the rules are ignored, but because no institution is designed to ask the upstream question. Should this process exist at all in its current form? So, regulation manages behavior within sectors. Prevention requires authority across them, and that authority is missing. What we are left with is a system that reacts locally, optimizes short-term objectives, and treats long-term systemic damage as an unfortunate but acceptable background condition. Not a scandal, not a failure, a design feature of governance built for a different era. This is where the conversation becomes specific. We often talk about the environment as if it were one topic. In reality, governance is fragmented. Agriculture, economy, energy, transport, industry, and environment. In theory, these departments coordinate. In practice, they operate with different incentives and time horizons. Agriculture is rewarded for yield and food security. Economy is rewarded for growth and jobs. Industry is rewarded for production and competitiveness. Environment is rewarded for compliance and reporting. Now consider a simple chain. Fertilizers are applied to fields. Rain comes. Drainage carries nutrients into streams. And streams become rivers, and rivers become deltas, and deltas become transport corridors into the ocean. So no one decides to damage the ocean. Everyone optimizes locally, and that is the structural problem. Environmental damage is not an event, it is a supply chain. And most ministries are built to govern sectors and not supply chains of damage. So the Environment Ministry speaks downstream of decisions' rights. The harm is visible, the process is obvious, and yet no one seems able to stop it. At this point, the system responds with formality. Taxes, permits, ISO standards, and impact assessments. These tools can matter, but they often measure process and not the outcome. A certification does not guarantee a functional ecosystem. A tax can become a license to continue. The state appears active because paperwork moves, but the river does not read reports. This is the hidden gap. Administrative sophistication can increase while physical systems degrade. Here is the uncomfortable truth. At the level of the state, systemic damage is often accepted by default, not because anyone wants it, but because reversing it feels institutionally impossible. We can't move factories, we can't rewrite agriculture, and we can't rebuild everything. So damage becomes normal. And once it becomes normal, it stops being questioned. That is how systems decay, not through collapse, but through routine. And at this point, many people say, so we need better enforcement. But enforcement is reactive. It acts after damage has crossed a line. What is missing is a function designed to prevent damage before it becomes administratively manageable. Not another framework and not another committee and not another report. A function with the authority to recognize damage early, to map where it accumulates, to interrupt the chain upstream, and to set phased prevention trajectories. And that function must sit above sectors, otherwise it becomes just another voice. Without it, we audit compliance but never system integrity. This is why the phrase matters when I say Ministry of Damage Prevention. I'm not proposing a new building or bureaucracy. I'm naming a missing function, and I deliberately use the word damage, not risk and not impact and not harm. Risk is possibility, impact can be debated. Harm easily becomes moral language. Damage is loss of function. Damage is irreversible change. Damage is reality with a timestamp. And we already live with it. We just avoid the word. We say externalities, adjustment, resilience, and adaptation. As long as damage is not named, it remains ownerless. The moment damage is named as damage, three things happen. Someone becomes responsible, a boundary appears, a later stops being an option. That is why the word is avoided, not because it is inaccurate, but because it is precise. Look at safety-critical industries. Shipping, aviation, nuclear, they all plan for failure because certain types of damage are non-negotiable. Now ask the quiet question, where is the contingency plan for environmental system failure. Not substitution and not relocation. Prevention. You cannot destroy one ecosystem and move to another forever. Eventually, there is nowhere left to move. The non-return point is not a prophecy, it is a recognition of phase. And in this phase, governance cannot be about comfort. It must be about integrity. Beyond the non-return point, clarity is not alarmism. It is a navigation. And prevention is not idealism. It is the only remaining form of control. If we continue to treat systemic damage as default, we will keep managing consequences without ownership. If we name it and design for prevention, we may still have room to maneuver. That is what a Ministry of Damage Prevention really means. Not hope and not fear, responsibility in a system that no longer waits.